If you've driven down an Australian freeway at any point in the last few years, you might have experienced a very specific kind of corporate deja vu. You look for a place to top up the tank and grab a coffee, and you see a logo towering over the road that shouldn't be there. The Ampol logo. Ampol is a relic from an era when servos still had driveway attendants who would actually pump your fuel for you, a mainstay for any road trip you might have taken with your parents back in the 90s. Ever since then though, the brand was essentially dead and buried, completely erased from the physical landscape of the country. But suddenly, the ghost is back. And it's not just back in a small, nostalgic way either, it's everywhere. Within the span of a few short years, almost 2,000 servos across the country have stripped off their familiar branding and slapped that retro Ampol logo right back onto their canopies. It's a massive, multi-million-dollar physical transformation happening right in front of our eyes. To make things even more confusing, the brand that Ampol is replacing is Caltex, the undisputed king of the Australian roadside. And just when you think you have a handle on that situation, you drive a little further down the road and see a completely different servo, one that used to be a Puma energy site, and it's now proudly wearing the Caltex logo. This is the physical fallout of one of the most chaotic, high-stakes corporate divorces in Australian business history. A story about multi-billion-dollar licensing agreements, secret boardroom maneuvers, a massive international scramble for market share, and a fierce legal brawl over who actually owns the color red. This modern corporate shell game is actually the climax of a turf war that started back in the early 1930s. At the time, the Australian fuel market was a closed loop, entirely controlled by foreign oil syndicates. If you owned a motor vehicle in Sydney or Melbourne, you were at the mercy of overseas interests, paying whatever price they dictated. This absolute reliance on foreign monopolies created a growing anxiety among motorists and local businesses who were getting fed up with inequitable pricing and the murky transfer pricing tactics used by these international titans. This frustration reached a boiling point in early 1936. A man named Sir William Gaston Walkley, alongside his associates William Arthur O'Callaghan and George Hutchison, decided they'd experienced enough of the foreign monopoly. They approached the National Roads and Motorists Association, widely known as the NRMA, and proposed that they wanted to form an entirely new, fully Australian company to market petrol and directly challenge the international giants. While the NRMA board ultimately decided they couldn't officially sponsor a commercial oil company, the members of that board were intrigued enough to help Walkley seek out local investors. The momentum built rapidly, and by March of 1936, the Australian Motorists Petrol Company was officially incorporated in New South Wales. This was the very first oil company that allowed the everyday Australian public to buy shares, giving them a chance to actually own a piece of the infrastructure powering their daily lives. Shortly after their first delivery of oil arrived at White Bay, the garage pumps were primed and the newly formed company was officially in business. Eventually, they would shorten their long, clunky corporate title into something much punchier, renaming themselves Ampol. Interestingly enough, during the exact same year, a massive corporate alliance was being forged on the other side of the globe. In the United States, two colossal entities, the Standard Oil Company of California, which we now know as Chevron, and the Texas company, known as Texaco, decided to join forces in a joint venture designed to aggressively expand into Africa, the Middle East, Asia, and Oceania. To cement this partnership, they simply combined the names of their respective home states of California and Texas to create a new, globally facing brand name known as Caltex. For the next several decades, these two companies operated on parallel tracks within the Australian market. Ampol was the scrappy local hero, leveraging its deep Australian heritage and public ownership to build a fiercely loyal customer base. They sponsored local sports, understood the unique demands of the vast Australian geography, and became a staple of the national identity. Caltex, meanwhile, brought the massive logistical power and deep pockets of an international conglomerate. They were competitors, fighting street by street and freeway by freeway for the loyalty of the Australian motorist. For nearly 60 years, this intense rivalry defined the Australian freeway. But fighting a street by street turf war across an entire continent eventually takes a massive financial toll. By the time the 1990s rolled around, the sheer cost of operating duplicate refineries and redundant distribution networks across such a massive, sparsely populated country was eating into everyone's profits. The executives at both companies eventually looked at their shrinking margins and came to the same conclusion. Rather than burning millions of dollars fighting each other, they could just team up and dominate the entire sector together. In 1995, the scrappy local underdog and the international giant finally called a truce. Ampol and Caltex executed a massive corporate merger that combined their supply chains, their refineries, and their retail footprints to create a single, incredibly powerful entity, eventually known as Caltex Australia Ltd. Overnight, this new company became an absolute juggernaut that controlled a massive slice of the national fuel infrastructure. To balance the power, Chevron, the American parent company of the Caltex brand, retained a controlling 50% stake in this new megacorporation, while the remaining 50% was held by Australian shareholders. However, this created a massive operational headache out on the road. Almost overnight, the newly formed company found itself running two distinctly different brands that were often sitting right across the intersection from each other, fiercely competing for the exact same commuters. This forced the board to make a decision about which brand would actually survive. Because Caltex had the immense global backing of Chevron, the beloved local identity was sacrificed, triggering a massive campaign in the late 1990s to systematically wipe the Ampol name off the Australian map. Crews swept through the entire network to rip down the classic signage, repaint the canopies, and swap out the uniforms, deliberately leaving just 10 isolated Ampol stations untouched across the entire country. Keeping those few remaining locations open was purely a legal calculation to stop the trademark from expiring, effectively locking the Ampol brand in a corporate basement so Caltex could reign as the undisputed face of the Aussie freeway. For the next 20 years, Caltex Australia operated as a highly profitable and highly visible cornerstone of the Australian economy. They built out massive convenience retail networks and integrated deeply with Woolworths while refining millions of barrels of crude oil at facilities like Kurnell and Lytton. But the foundation of this entire empire rested on a very specific legal technicality. Caltex Australia didn't actually own the name printed on their own buildings. They were essentially renting it from Chevron in the United States. And in 2015, the dynamic of this relationship underwent a seismic shift. Chevron executives in California were reviewing their global portfolio and decided they needed to free up a massive amount of capital. They looked at their 50% ownership stake in Caltex Australia Ltd, saw an incredibly valuable asset, and decided to cash out. In what became a historic financial maneuver, Chevron sold its entire shareholding to a broad range of Australian and global institutional investors. This sale fundamentally changed the nature of the Australian company, and for the first time since the 1995 merger, Caltex Australia was a completely independent and standalone entity with its own board, its own shareholders, and total control over its own operational destiny. However, they were still operating under the Caltex banner, and to ensure business continuity and keep the fuel flowing without panicking their customer base, the newly independent Australian company entered into a formal trademark license agreement with Chevron. This contract stipulated that Caltex Australia would pay a premium for the exclusive right to continue using the Caltex name, the highly lucrative StarCard loyalty brand, and all associated visual identities across the country. The arrangement worked flawlessly for a few years. Caltex Australia continued to generate massive profits while expanding their operations into Singapore and New Zealand, eventually setting up trading offices in Houston. They were an independent powerhouse wrapped in a familiar rented uniform. But renting your corporate identity leaves you vulnerable to the landlord, and in December 2019, Chevron decided to call in the lease, dropping a catastrophic bombshell on the local executives by issuing a formal notice to terminate the agreement. This triggered a strict, non-negotiable legal timeline where Caltex Australia would only keep their exclusive rights to the brand until the end of 2021. From there, they would enter a tense 12-month transition period sharing the name, before being legally barred from ever displaying the Caltex logo again by the 31st of December 2022. The executives in Sydney suddenly had to find a new identity and execute a nationwide rollout at an unprecedented speed. Thankfully for them, they could simply walk down to the corporate basement and dust off the trademark they'd kept alive on those 10 isolated stations. When they ran the market research, the data showed that the Ampol brand was still deeply trusted across the country by people of all ages, including younger generations who weren't even born when the original stations were retired. Realizing they already owned a brand with massive historical equity, the board made the definitive decision to bring Ampol back to the freeways. Once the executives officially greenlit the return of the brand, the next step was making it legally binding. At the company's annual general meeting in May 2020, the shareholders voted to accept their new reality. Caltex Australia formally changed its corporate name to Ampol Limited, and their stock ticker on the Australian Securities Exchange officially updated to reflect the new era. But changing a name on a legal document is the easy part. Changing the physical signage on nearly 2,000 pieces of commercial real estate spread across the harshest continent on Earth is an entirely different beast. Ampol was suddenly facing one of the most complex and expansive rebranding exercises in retail history. They had to systematically rip the Caltex signs off towering roadside pylons, redesign thousands of overhead canopies, update the digital interfaces of the fuel pumps, manufacture thousands of new uniforms, and completely overhaul their digital infrastructure. All of this had to be executed perfectly under a strictly enforced legal ticking clock, courtesy of Chevron. The physical rollout officially began in late 2020. They started by opening the first revitalized Ampol stores in the Sydney suburbs of Concord and Granville to use as a blueprint for the rest of the country. Once they perfected the process, the company moved at a blistering pace and rebranded over 100 locations every single month. But they also had to manage complicated corporate partnerships. A massive retailer called the EG Group had recently purchased the petrol station attached to the Woolworths supermarkets. This meant that nearly 540 of those specific locations had to undergo a highly coordinated double transformation. Construction crews had to completely rebrand the convenience store from Woolworths to EG, while simultaneously swapping out the massive fuel canopy from Caltex to Ampol. And to ensure the public embraced the resurrected brand as a modern energy provider, they partnered with a company called Saatchi & Saatchi to launch the Powering Our Way of Life campaign, pivoting their entire image toward a future of electric vehicles and decarbonization. Then, to permanently burn the new logo into the national consciousness, they poured millions into high-visibility sports sponsorships, securing the naming rights for the State of Origin Rugby League series and throwing their financial weight behind the Red Bull Ampol racing team in the Supercars Championship. Financially speaking, the aggressive pivot worked flawlessly. By the end of the 2022 financial year, Ampol Ltd recorded a profit of $795 million, successfully pulling off the ultimate corporate magic trick of replacing their entire physical facade without losing a single drop of customer loyalty. But that seamless transition is exactly what caught the attention of their former partners in California. While the executives in Sydney were busy celebrating their record profits, Chevron was watching the entire rollout with intense legal scrutiny. The American giant had successfully taken their name back, and they were absolutely determined to make sure the Australian company didn't take any residual brand equity along with it. As the rebranding effort really gained speed in early 2021, Chevron went on the offensive and dragged Ampol into the Australian federal court. The American company filed a massive lawsuit claiming that Ampol was deliberately violating the terms of their breakup and actively misleading everyday consumers in the process. Stripping away all the complex legal jargon, Chevron essentially built their entire case around three very specific complaints regarding exactly how the rollout was being handled out on the streets. The first major sticking point revolved around customer loyalty. Chevron was absolutely furious that Ampol was still actively promoting and accepting the highly lucrative Caltex Star Card at their newly rebranded Servo. On top of that, the American giant accused Ampol of deliberately muddying the waters by using the registered Caltex marks right alongside the new Ampol logos in their advertising. According to the lawsuit, this was a calculated tactic designed to lean on the established Caltex reputation to artificially prop up the new locations. But while the loyalty cards and the advertising made for standard corporate warfare, the most fascinating and heavily contested part of the entire lawsuit actually revolved around paint. For 25 years, a defining element of the Caltex visual identity was the striking red-colored fascia wrapping around the outer edge of the towering overhead canopies. As construction crews rushed through the massive rebranding process, they naturally swapped out the main logos for the signature blue and red Ampol design. However, to save both time and money, they simply left the physical red canopy fascia completely intact at many of the locations. Chevron argued that this specific shade of red was intrinsically linked to their brand and insisted that leaving it up actively confused the consumer. They ultimately demanded that the Australian company immediately repaint the canopies to a completely different color. But when the dispute finally landed before Justice O'Callaghan, his ruling delivered a brutal reality check for the Chevron legal team. Addressing the massive argument over the red paint, the judge completely dismantled their case simply by looking at the exact literal wording of the contract. Because the agreement only required Ampol to remove actual signage displaying the registered trademarks, Justice O'Callaghan ruled that as a matter of ordinary English, it made absolutely no sense to interpret that specific clause as an obligation to completely repaint a red-colored piece of metal. By officially determining that a red stripe is not a trademark, the judge secured Ampol the legal right to keep their highly efficient transition rolling without spending millions on unnecessary renovations. Chevron was ultimately forced to accept the harsh reality that while they could take back their famous name, they simply couldn't take the paint. This brings us to the ultimate question at the center of this entire corporate saga. Why did Chevron choose to suddenly terminate that licensing agreement back in 2019? For years, they were collecting massive, completely risk-free royalty checks from Ampol, all just for letting the Australian company paint the word Caltex on their buildings. Walking away from that kind of guaranteed income seems completely irrational on paper, but the truth is that Chevron never actually wanted to permanently leave the country. When the American giants sold off their 50% ownership stake in 2015, they were simply freeing up capital for other global ventures. By the time 2019 rolled around, the executives in California were hungry to aggressively re-enter the highly lucrative Australian retail fuel market on their very own terms, and to pull that off successfully, they absolutely needed their flagship brand name back. Chevron obviously knew they couldn't just build 1,000 brand new servos from scratch, as finding the commercial real estate and securing all those permits would take decades of construction. So instead of building from the ground up, they decided to execute a massive corporate buyout to instantly buy their way back into the game. In late 2019, at the exact same moment they were quietly handing Ampol that strict termination notice, Chevron officially agreed to acquire the Australian operations of Puma Energy for a staggering $425 million. Since Puma was one of the largest independent retail chains in the country at the time, the buyout instantly handed Chevron a ready-made national infrastructure featuring a sprawling network of over 360 retail sites alongside massive distribution depots and crucial seaboard import terminals. With that massive Puma infrastructure officially secured, the ultimate Chevron master plan was finally revealed to the Australian public. The moment Ampol completely lost their exclusive rights to the Caltex name, the American giant immediately launched a nationwide program to rebrand their newly acquired Puma network into brand new Caltex servos, completely flipping the board on their former partners. This strategy created the bizarre and whiplash-inducing reality that everyday Australian motorists face on the roads today. The massive and ubiquitous network of corner stations that the public always knew as Caltex has been entirely transformed into Ampol. Meanwhile, the smaller and entirely separate network of freeway stations that everyone used to know as Puma is now operating as Caltex. These two corporate energy giants essentially executed a high-speed identity swap while driving down the freeway, spending hundreds of millions of dollars just to end up fiercely competing against each other under completely different banners. But what do you think? Were you confused when the local Caltex suddenly turned into an Ampol overnight? Do you think Chevron made the right move by buying the Puma network, or does the resurrected Ampol brand hold too much loyalty to be beaten? Let us know your thoughts and any memories of the old school Ampol stations in the comments section below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the chaotic world of corporate rebranding, make sure to like and subscribe for more business autopsies. Thank you guys so much for watching, and as always, stay curious.